So at the end of the day on Saturday, we had added a seed crystal and scratched the result of the hot reaction of morpholine and t-butyl acetoacetate, but it hadn't come out. And I scratched it one more time on my way out, and it immediately solidified into this kind of yellow-orange block. And you can see it's so solid that, in fact, the glass rod is stuck in there now. So we should be able to isolate that solid. We will set up our usual assembly for filtration. And grabbing a piece of filter paper. And we'll probably need a spatula to break up, or a spatula to break up that material. This one's variable. Sometimes it comes right out in the freezer the first time. And sometimes it requires a bunch of messing with, like we had to this time. I'm going to leave that out. Might need it. Just want to make sure that covers everything. Good vacuum. Yeah, so I'll need a pipette or two. I'm also going to need an ice bath so I can chill some of that ether for doing a washing. I reformatted the card on this, so we'll see if the camera decides to keep turning itself off like it did last week. That's more ether than I'm going to need. Just chill down about 30 milliliters. Should be plenty. Squirt about 2 milliliters of ether in there. Should break that up enough to allow me to pull the glass stirring rod out. I actually want that block back. Just try to scrape the solid off the stirring rod. A lot of orange color in the solid right now, but the pure product is not orange, as you can see from the fact that some of the solid at the top there was relatively white. A little piece of solid there. Flick that back in. So I'm going to use the pointy tip of this to try to suspend that solid as well as I can in the ether and break it up so we don't have those large chunks. Then it'll wash better. Fortunately, this material is relatively insoluble in ether, so I can use it as a transfer agent. You can see that that's kind of a yellowy suspension, lemon yellow suspension. Just trying to scrape all the solid off the walls of the vial. And then I'm going to ice that. I'll try to maximize the yield. A little bit more solid here. Kind of escaped. Wet down that filter paper and make sure it seals tightly. Stir that a little bit, get good contact. Make sure I don't get any water in it when I filter. It's still really chunky in there. Require a little bit more ether to get that to transfer. See that it's rapidly losing its color as the ether filters through. The yellow color going into the filtrate. Thick slurry. As always, there's a little bit of a trade-off between getting all your solid out of the vial and dissolving some of it in the solvent. So I'm going to call that probably good enough so as not to lose any more during the washing. A little bit around the outside. And rinse my pipette. Rinse my spatula in. So now what we want to do is just wash that with cold ether. crunch up the solid a little bit to try to expose as much surface area as possible. I want to be careful not to disturb the surface of the filter paper though, so that the solid can't escape around the outside. I'd like to get most of that orange color away from the product. I'm going to call that good. I think if I do too much more, I will lose product. You can definitely see a little bit of solid that's collecting in the filtrate. So what I'm going to do is switch flasks. Pour this back through to try to trap that last bit of solid and also wash the remaining color out. Got a little bit of oil there that we don't want. We'll leave that behind. And then one last wash. Should be good. There's a little bit of orange in there, but at this point I'm going to leave it. And then when I crunch it up, I'll try not to take the orange part when I do my analysis. So we've got a kind of a pale yellow powder with some orange impurities in some of the chunks. But it's not looking too bad. We'll let a little bit of air go through that to dry off the ether. Since this ether is still good, pour that back in. So now while that's drying, let's weigh a 50 or a 10 milliliter beaker. Oops. That one's not clean. Clean that one later. We'll stick a label on this guy. And I'm now on page 60 of my notebook. So this for me is going to be DCL-10-60A. Get a mass on that beaker. We're looking at 9.190 grams. Just break the vacuum. can see maybe a little cloudiness. Some solid still went through. We should get a reasonable yield. Just get a clean micro spatula. This one's kind of bent. Bend that back. Transfer that solid out of there. It's a little wet because there's some moisture in the air that's adhered to it, so that'll go in the desiccator to dry for at least 20 minutes or so before we try to get a GC mass spec. For GC mass spec, it doesn't matter if it's a little wet, and it'll be sitting in the desiccator for a while before we can run an MR because the instrument is still down. So it'll be good and dry by the time we're ready to actually run an NMR spectrum. You can see that it's not entirely colorless, but it's pretty light. At least the sections where it's not trapping impurities, where it became powdery. And filter paper is going to go with it, I think. Well, maybe not. Try to leave that filter paper behind if I can. And not losing much, be fine. So I'm just going to crunch that up because it will dry better in the desiccator if I make it as powdery as possible.